Okay, so we will get started. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the very first virtual STEM poetry reading series at Farmingdale State College. This was funded by a 2022 Students First grant, and the series has two primary goals. First, to expose the FSC community to the work of poets writing about or working within STEM. And second, to enhance the FSC community's engagement with STEM majors through conversation with authors about the synergistic relationship between STEM and poetry. So before we begin, a few things. I do apologize for having my camera off. I did have a change of venue today, and I'm currently hosting this session from home. So I seem to be able to avoid freezing if I keep my video streaming to a minimum. Currently, camera and microphone access is also disabled for attendees. So if you do want to make comments throughout the reading, please feel free to utilize the chat feature. And if you have questions for our readers, please use the Q&A feature, and we will get to those questions at the close of the reading. If you do feel comfortable, please share where you're coming from tonight. If you're a member of the Farmingdale State College, please feel free to share your department or your major if you're a student. And please note that this reading will be recorded and made available via YouTube. So if you would like to receive a reminder when the recording or the other readings will be taking place, please use the reminder link that is already in the chat, and I will copy it again if anybody needs that. Finally, if you have been to a poetry reading in the past, you'll note that ours has a little bit of a twist. Each of our poets is going to read for approximately 20 minutes, and following that, we'll have a bit of a discussion about the synergy between poetry and STEM work and vice versa, and we'll end with a little challenge for the audience. So with that, I would like to introduce our first poet tonight, Lisa Rosenberg. So formerly trained as a physicist, pilot, and poet, Lisa Rosenberg is the author of the poetry collection A Different Physics from Red Mountain Press, and recent essays on the phenomenon of flight, burdens of memorabilia, and poetics as applied systems. She writes from everyday wonder, informed by science and engaged through human sensibilities and non-specialist diction. Many of her poems explore kinship beyond our planetary or species identity, patterns in nature, and questions of inherited models. Lisa worked as an engineer in the U.S. space program and is a frequent speaker on the confluence of arts and sciences, focusing on shared tools essential to inquiry and enterprise. The recent recipient of a Jurassic Residency, Wallace Stanger Fellowship, and Mosaic America Fellowship, she serves as the 2017-2018 Poet Laureate of San Mateo County, California. You can find her poems and essays in venues such as Poetry, the Three Penny Review, The Common, Amsterdam Quarterly, Organizational Aesthetics, and California Fire and Water, a climate crisis anthology. Welcome, Lisa.
Thank you, Danielle. I'm just really delighted and honored to be here. Thank you for using that database where you found me. And I'm also really honored to be reading with TJ, whose work I admire. And we have, having been at some of her talks in the past, I know we have a lot of common ground, so it'll be fun to be in discussion. I'm also thrilled to be talking at a venue that has an aeronautics department and a professional piloting program. So at Danielle's suggestion, I'm going to include some aviation poems, including the first one, which is called 360. To bank over and turn around a point. Nothing but sky framing your high wing, fields below. Tree canopies, streams, and sparse roads. Both the shadow of a low cloud and the cloud whose flight path glides beneath your own. A band of soft hills leading to the coast. The voice of sun on the horizon's ageless arc. I wanted to start with that for two reasons, partly because of aviation, but also because we'll probably be talking a lot about process tonight. And that piece, I found that working in the structure, however awkward, of 5 feet, this 5-foot line, kept me aloft. Quite literally, it kept me aloft in experience, so that instead of describing what I thought I remember from this lovely experience, I could actually be there. It put me there in that pivot in the sky. And that is what working in a practice like poetry can help us connect with. The next piece is space. My father brought home the blue-jacketed, government-issued views of the surface of the moon, parsed, printed, and bearing the crosshairs of our optics on mottled fields where illusion made bubbles of craters as we watched. My small body tracking toward a moon cycle still years away, toward wings I would seek to merit, and a paper to confirm my degree in postulating the deep workings of a universe, but not the world who sings to us first, before the logic of reason, before speech, equations forged in the engines of memory, hot interiors of moments that meld thought to muscle and words to thought. That early immersion brought me around to love of flight, space exploration, and ironically working in a place where language could be very tightly controlled, and that brought me to a place of a lot of internal conflict. The satellite sky. As we dine, the satellites spin. We work and sleep. They pass the rim of a village, blank with snow. Everywhere the day unfolds. A monkey flinches in the banyan limbs at the lip of a southern continent. A missile stack. The storm eyes path beneath the woven sky of satellites. Several hundred artificial sisters to the moon. Their turning drums, petals splayed, antennae like radiant stamens. The bulbous roots of others pace along their gentle arcs. Relay a voice in numbers. Return to us the likes of forestation, sea ice, smoke. The good people of one country indistinguishable from the next. My metal desk a drop in the metropolis. The great birds glide in their orbits, fan themselves, jeweled heads humming in a stream of signals. What moves at the center of their gas hearts? Delicate as a pistol. They are the Ptolemaic angels of the age, deities simple as stars. Beneath the lenses of their tempered eyes, a launch site slumbers. A combine rusts in a field of weeds I entered in a dream, knowing if I brought my words to the marsh at its far edge, still I could tell no one, not even the reeds. It took me a very long time to be able to write about that in poetry, and I would say 2 decades longer in prose, where things can be more explicit. This next is a very short piece from that same environment, where there was so much fantastic and also mundane scenery, and all of those kind of begged to be animated. Polygraph. What are they sampling? These slender antennae whose clubbed tips startle and drift over paper tape. Which truths do they taste? How many evade the thin, dark sap they weep? So I'm going to shift now to a different set of poems, although still very much launched by compelling objects, some organic, some not, and some ekphrastic, meaning some responding to works of art. The first is called moon jellies. And if you haven't been to an aquarium like the Monterey Bay Aquarium, where they've pioneered these displays of the jellyfish, it's really spectacular. Moon jellies. Animate, in the backlit, black tank, you fly. Lace-edged ghost bells, propelled by such grace as I cannot match with my clumsy spine, my opacity, the aging truths inside me, unseen and unborn, stung by the fact of your eggs in art rose, hot flower in a clear skull. This next piece is, the next two are explicitly ekphrastic, meaning they were written in response to works of art. And the first one was really one of those instances of having this kind of broad pool of models and terms available to us from arts and sciences and technology. The piece of art was square, which, my first thought is, that's a really unusual aspect ratio in portraiture or art. That's why we say things like portrait or landscape mode. And so thinking more about aspect ratio, which is a word that does not appear anywhere in any of the poems, but that kind of launched me into playing with language and expressions around the notion or the word square, and then playing with sound patterns and memory and association from there. Square nothing. Square the circle. Look me squarely in the eye and say, we are more than the layers of our days. An overcoat, a face, the suitcase of tucked away remembrances to temper loss. Square nothing. Anchor me as talismans dissolve. Drop into my palm the compass, whose north is synonymous with love. So that poem was really one of those surprising trips to find out, wow, look where I landed, and how cool was that, or how much fun that was. And I'm glad I didn't try to make it be something different. These next two are fairly new, one unpublished, and sometimes I read them in a short grouping that goes in increasing order of entropy. So the first being an Elizabethan sonnet, and the second being a prose poem. And the sonnet was probably the longest running prompt ever. It was from an undergraduate professor in astronomy who kind of threw down the gauntlet. And that was 30 something years ago. So the pandemic gave me time to learn about the wisdom inherent in this form and all the dynamics that go way beyond the number of lines or the rhyme pattern. For the gibbous moon. No one writes sonnets for the gibbous moon, quipped a young astronomy professor decades ago beside a chalkboard strewn with shapes of truth, beneath a dome that bore indifferent gravity. I heard the calm progress of song, how the moon's ungainly phase, wholehearted, if not full, cupped in the palm of night's penumbra, finds so little praise to claim. Human arts embrace the crescent, neglect the moon, whose name cites melody, whose light wanders lake tops, lenses, casement windows, inscribes on creature memory a language equal to the sun's singed mirror, brilliance enough for all who sleep or stir. So if and when that finally lands a home, I need to track down and send it to that professor. And the other bookend to that, in a much more open form, prose poetry is something that I really couldn't get my head around for the longest time. And then with quarantine, I had a lot less driving, and more time for writing things that could be larger than what I carried in my head. So I wrote more in prose and then found my way through prose to the prose poem. This piece is part of an ekphrastic project that was done by the Livermore Poet Laureate, Cynthia Patton, and the works were displayed and we recently read with the artwork. It's a blue and white photograph, quite close in, of a sunflower, and the poem is called Sunflower. The center of anything has work to do. Bearing, spinning, taking things in, sending them out again. Pupil and iris, axle and hub. The dense, dark center of our gathered stars, swathed in what light it hasn't swallowed, dragging bright dust in arced scarves, aster to aster, disc to disc, the way a word begets a world. Say inflorescence. Say one bent petal rests on the rim, a tear, an inflection. Say the mind travels there. A foot explores the unexpected curve. So I'm going to close with two pieces about making. And I feel really just incredibly grateful to have grown up with makers on both sides of the family, artists on my mom's side and tinkerers and mechanics on my dad's side. And always this model of playful tinkering and diligent play and vice versa, and making mistakes and approximations, and the joy and delight in all of that. The first one is named for one of my father's original model airplane designs. The Aerobat. High on his shoulder, my father holds one of his progeny for the world to see. The Los Angeles sky is an almost forgotten blue above his quiet smile, and he is far younger than I am now. The cowling glints, the propeller spotless, installed for the snapshot, no doubt. I can feel the odd empty heft of balsa, the sandy finish of dope on taut wingskin through which the ribs are visible at a distance greater than years. Oh, weekend days of wood parts drying on wax paper at the kitchen table, my mother worried over glue fumes and X-Acto blades as engines cured in the oven, as engines bathed in our garage and solder smoked beside an ashtray. The workbench teeming, tools and piece parts, a rambling terrain anchored by a rounded steel vise. Push rods and plywood, spinners and pins, plans or boxed kits for models fashioned with deference as his questions took root. As he ventured, slide rule in hand, to draft the Aerobat, to meet what years of practice and delight had seeded in him. And this is how we land, forging our own craft and finding origin. I think I'll leave it there. That gives us a little more time for questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Lisa. That was wonderful. Our next reader is TJ Jarrett. TJ Jarrett is a writer and software developer in Nashville, Tennessee. Her recent work has been published in Poetry, Boston Review, Beloit Poetry Journal, Callaloo, VQR, and others. She has earned scholarships from Colrain Manuscript Conference, fellowships from Sewanee Writers Conference, and was the winner of VQR's Emily Clark Balch Prize for Poetry, and a runner-up for New Issues Poetry Prize. She has been anthologized in Language Lessons by Third Man Books and Best American Non-Required Reading 2015 from Houghton-Mifflin and others. In 2017, she was awarded the George Garrett New Writing Award by the Fellowship of Southern Writers. Her debut collection, Ain't No Grave, was published with New Issues Press in 2012. Her second collection, Zion, winner of the Crab Orchard Open Competition in 2013, was published by Southern Illinois University Press. Thanks so much for joining us, TJ.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thanks. Thank you guys so much for being here. I know from being a college student that you could be doing any number of things. I actually am, one correction, I don't live in Nashville anymore, which is weird. I've not even changed my bio. I've been in Denmark for the last 3 years. Yes, if I had some Zeitgeist, American thing to talk about that you could be doing, I would tell you that. That's usually how I open up these readings. I'm going to just kind of jump into the work, and I'm going to slowly explain as we go from piece to piece exactly my methodology for doing that. I am by trade. I work in software. I've worked in specifically medical software from give or take the last 20 years. Because of that, when I look at the world, as a system, as a set of problems and how to solve it. But first, we must isolate, name the problem itself. We must first, triage and diagnose those problems. And let's start off here with interrobang. Come now, interrogate the mixing bowl of my throat and claim what is left in it. Query and bang the need to annotate uncertainty and awe occur so often we erect symbols to signify its gaps between. That we are not dead, yet know we will die. That we are both thought and matter, the erotic paradox. You know hunger, and you will hunger as long as you live. You could be made sick. There could be a swift, sweet poison in these words. And of such sweetness men have died. I would not have you die of want. How to speak to the dead. This is how it works. They talk and you listen. Let them go on at length about the harp lessons and the catalog of their regrets. And then let them begin their questions. And most often, they will ask about the minutiae of the earth. They will ask you to detail the habits of the grass and the trees. They will ask you to tell them about the current cycle of cicadas, the red eyes, the husks, the current cycle that is sleep. Tell them about your latest visit to the psychiatrist. Tell them how he diagnosed you what you experience right now to be a form of complicated grief. And over their brittle laughter, protest. No, wait, I paid for that. Tell them that your husband left last winter and expect their shrugs. Allow them to continue. Can you tell us again how it feels to be cold? Can you remind us of the colors the leaves make in autumn? How does it feel to want? Tell them about the dream about the invasion. No, wait, the one about the fire. How there was a fire in the shape of men marching the streets. how the bystanders threw themselves headlong into the pageant, their burning hands destroying all they touched until there was nothing left in the world but you and ash. Ask them if death is like that. They'll say, nothing gone stays gone here. You are never alone in death. Listen, say, that's the worst part of all. This is in my first book. And How to Speak to the Dead is actually the book itself, and I won't be reading from all of it, is an examination about race in America. And I take the same kind of analysis that I take when I look at a lot of really bad code. I kind of sit there, I look at the code, I ask myself, okay, what was it supposed to do? What was its exact function? Where is it going wrong? Is the problem itself a matter? Is it systemic? Is it working as function? Is it supposed to be functioning in this way? How can it be improved, etc.? That's kind of how I approach life, really. I kind of scrum master my relationships too. Are we doing what we're supposed to do? What did we do yesterday? What are we doing today? I find that the scientific method is something that one can use, and one should use, and one should scrutinize every aspect of your life. I think that that's actually your life is easier in that way. Or maybe it's because I'm just emotional and a poet, which I am by temperament, I think, a poet. And it helps me, clear out the feelings about things and really talk about the actual brass tacks and actions and things, how things function in the world. This one, this is called Lazarus. My father's a minister. And I've always thought that people coming from the dead is weird, but I think what's really weird is forced resurrection when you died. And if you think about death as a nap, it's not cool to wake me up if I thought I was going to be dead because I thought I'd be playing harps or something. So this one is called Lazarus. Imagine his surprise. Disoriented in the dark and damp of the tomb, all alone and all at once. Hadn't he quit the flesh? Tired of Martha's nagging, don't bother yourself, Lazarus. Don't strain yourself, Lazarus. And his sister Mary's muffled cries. Then the knock. Then the calling of his name. Did he turn his back to the sound at first and cry out, it's early yet? Say, not now. Ask, why me? And then the sound of the weeping boy god who summoned him. Could he not unburden himself of the skin sack with the ribbon muslin that bound him? Did the light from the open door blind? When he staggered from the tomb, did he first hear the wind's bloated sigh across the land, or the shapes of his sister barreling toward him blurred in his sight, or hear the fat-footed cadence of their approach? How could any one sense measure their jubilee? Did he rejoice with them, or is 3 days long enough to miss any one thing, even this earth? Did the body flooded with sweet air, how does that compare to heaven? How small now, this earth, how tinny its birdsong, how sloven the tree's corporeal array. Another one of my, actually I use this for inspiration when I'm working on things. I read the paper every day. I've done so since September 11th, simply because I thought maybe it was something I missed, and it's become this kind of daily thing for me. And so I read the paper. I obviously can't read the whole thing. I just make sure that I'm very, very informed about the world that's going on around me. But I also have this love of really old newspapers. I find them fascinating. The things that people can say and people won't say. And this particular article was pulled out of the New York Times. And I'll tell you the title, and then I can tell you the situation after I finish reading the poem. It's called Negroes Lie on Top of Weakening Levee and Save Day near Greenville, Mississippi, April 11th, 1912. Harold first walked right up when they asked him, unfolded each limb, drew up the earth into his haunches, carried that body up and laid down. Clarence too. There was a heaving in the earth, body after body raised up. There was a give in that earth, and they came. Lumbered up the levee's flanks, silent as stones. Through the night they lay atop the levee, dreamed their stony dreams. In the night the levee built itself of eyes and teeth, and when sun came, it sang. April 11th, 1912. Every 20 years, the Mississippi River floods itself. It's an alluvial plain. It's supposed to do that. And this is the period of time when the Army Corps of Engineers tried to harness the Mississippi River. And so they had basically had a stalemate between those on the west side of the river on the east side of the river. The east side of the river was more prosperous, so they had higher levees on that side. In 1912, when the levees broke, in Arkansas, it went out, literally let out 60 miles into Arkansas. In Mississippi, where things are planted closer to the levee, it did not break as much. However, in Greenville, where literally the town is like, I want to say it's like 15 feet beneath the river layer to begin with. There's actually a levee in downtown. When it broke, there was just so much, like buildings, etc. There's just like things that are quote unquote of worth there that when they ran out of sand, which as one is wont to do, I guess, when you live on a river, when they ran out of sand, they collected all the black men of the town at gunpoint and asked them to lie down on the levee until they could get more sand from farther north. I could not put my head around that. I couldn't imagine it. And then I had to put myself into the people who actually did do that, and to realize that not only are these people who are oppressing them, literally at gunpoint, asking them to lie on the levee, and you're saving their houses, also downstream are your houses, which is a terrifying thing to actually reckon with. But the asking and coercion, I think the word choice in this, I think, is what makes that poem work. Came right up when they asked him, as if at gunpoint isn't asking. It's just it's a fascinating period of time. Mississippi fascinates me. So that was my first book. So my second book was all about Mississippi because, why not? Let's go all in. But this one is the second one that I also pulled from a headline. And I'll cover that in a second. This is called "The Burgomaster Said I Could Do Whatever I Wanted to You," and then added, "I will turn my back and look away. But as you entered the room, shuffling and jangling your change and smelling after day after day after day of yourself, I thought of forgiveness, which is to say, I thought of myself. I stood there without a word to offer. And then I remembered the fires we fled, the night after day after night in darkness, the girl's screams in her dying, the baby you left on the grass, crying and crying until it didn't, and then the growling of the dogs. All the while you were silent and watching me as you'd always been. And as I turned to leave, I thought to myself, I can look away. I can choose to give you nothing. I can still save myself. This poem was There was a interview with a woman who was in Rwanda. I guess I would call them during the Troubles. I don't know what the euphemism they use for it. In Rwanda during the genocide. And she was actually taped into a wall in a bathroom to save her. And so she was in that bathroom. And so she heard everything. The family who was protecting her was still killed. And she survived because she was in the wall. And when she goes to the jail, the burgomaster, which I guess is the warden, said that she could confront the leader of the men who came to the house. And she looked at him and realized, and he said they could do anything you want to him, and she actually meant it. And she looked at him and she left because that's the only thing that, that preserved her humanity. The Peonies at the Bodega. Were this a poem, and I were just arranging for the sound, we would be standing in rain and not snow. I would have left on foot and gathered my coat against weather. I would not hail a taxi. I would not raise my hand against the glass as if to gesture against morning. And you would not be left standing alone among the hothouse flowers at the bodega near Mott and Broom. When we made love that afternoon, we would have taken all our clothes off. You would have removed your left sock, for example. In the poem I would write, the women on the street would not notice how much we loved or that we fairly glowed of it, nor would they bustle by, clucking and smiling knowingly. In the poem, you would have hailed the cab yourself, opened the door, and then shut me up in it. I would have kept my eyes forward. I would not have watched you grow smaller and smaller through the rear window, and you would not have waved and waved and waved. And the poem would be near dusk, and that would be a metaphor about how the earth participates in the end of things. I mentioned the owners of the bodega were an old married couple, restocking the produce to guard against decay. I'd mentioned the flowers. They would be peonies, and peonies would stand in for something else. When I wrote this poem, it was really to write. It was talking about really how to rewrite histories. Yes, I was, in Soho in New York, waving to a lover that I would never see again. And I was thinking about how to reconstruct that. And even starting with, if this were a poem, which I actually sat and wrote, I was writing in my journal, like it did not begin life as a poem. If this were a poem, I would do this. And then the errand became, what would I do? And can I still create a narrative talking in the negative of what didn't happen and what happens when you're, juxtaposing the what did and what didn't happen in that narrative. I think I found it a very, very interesting exercise. I think it worked, maybe, I'm not really sure. This is your 2-poem warning for the end of the reading. These are a couple of more recent poems that I wrote. But this is actually the same. This one's called Alternatives, which is actually the same kind of errand. I'm hoping I'm not sure which one is more or less successful. But this is a imagination of what would happen. There has been the end of a relationship. What would have happened if I had the alternative? So, alternatives. In one, I married the first man who asked, and I endured. Took as little space as I could, opened my hands, and he'd place my faults, lined up like Eucharists, into my palms until overflowing. Maybe he'd found God sooner. Maybe if he'd found, I'm sorry, I'm going to replay that. Maybe if he'd found God sooner, the baby would have lived. Maybe I wouldn't have found myself alone in the blue light and the linoleum, passing something too small to survive. Maybe if I'd loved him enough, she'd wanted to live. maybe I would too. Maybe I would have played the hymns his God demanded on the church piano, and he'd stand in the pulpit singing, his tenor singing high and then low again, and I could remember God himself. Maybe I would have stayed for that. Maybe when he called years later, I could have returned. Maybe I would have loved his children and traded them for the dead. Maybe I would wear white on Sundays, pull on my gloves, hold the women when they raised up during service, wipe their sweat, hold them fast as they sing, Hallelujah, Hallelujah. Maybe I could be the woman swooning. Maybe his God could move through me just once like that. Maybe God could fill me so tight with spirit, I'd split like stars. I really did have an ex-boyfriend call me, like, he's like complete asshole. Asshole. He was a jerk. And he did call me like 15 years later. It's like, I made this life mistake. I'm like, it has been 15 years. Why are you here? But it was very interesting. It's like, what would have happened had this, had that relationship happened? I think if anyone takes 15 years to get back to you, you probably made a good decision. But this one is called Fort Comfort. This is after M. Degas teaches art and science at Durfee Intermediate School, Detroit, 1942, by Philip Levine. That's a super, super famous poem and a fantastic poet, one of my favorite, Philip Levine. I love him to death. And this is also a poem about being in a classroom and finding how the world splits and how it, like, really differentiating yourself. It's kind of this moment of discovery of finding yourself as something else, as something apart from the crowd of people. There's this moment, I think, in everyone's life when you suddenly you began as as part of a unit, and suddenly you find yourself both differentiated and fully yourself, and also kind of alone. I think that's what I think is interesting about that poem. But Fort Comfort is similar moment as me as a kid reading at Fort Comfort, which is the first place that slaves came to America. That was their first point of entry. And incidentally, my grade school was across the harbor from it. I could literally see it from my math classroom. So, Fort Comfort. The nun stood by the chalkboard and wrote the word America, underlined it twice and said, "What do you see here?" Elizabeth shot her hand up and said, "It's home. My grandmother came here so that we could live." The nun asked the rest of the class who else came, and the children shouted the countries of origin, except me. I was the only Black girl in the room, and I stared off toward the sea, as I often did during history class, already imagining myself far away from this place. The nun said, "Who else?" And the children were quiet. And the nun said, "Some came in chains." They all looked at me, and I turned my eyes back toward Fort Comfort and imagined a ship docking there and the cargo descending toward the pier. Rachel, a serious girl with brown eyes, which always appeared to be on the verge of overflowing, asked, "What happened to the men before us?" The nun said, "We killed them," her voice wavering. She cleared her throat. "We killed them," and then she looked each of us in the eye. I turned my eyes to the sea again, and I could make out the figure of a woman waving to get my attention, as if she knew me, as if my staring back across time, across water, meant her survival, meant something. And the nun went on and on about how nothing could divide us, and I wondered how long 400 years is, how many bodies, how suffering was multiplied between them. What is forever? Thank you.
Thank you so much, TJ. Some really powerful poems. So I am going to switch gears right now. If I can get back to my slides, just one moment. And what I'd like to do is shift to a discussion. Again, if I can get my slides together. Hold on one moment. Here we are. Okay, we're close. So again, thank you so much for sharing all of those poems. One of the reasons that I wanted to start this series was in part from reflecting on the intersection between information retrieval and poetry in my own work. As a librarian, I need to be able to quickly and efficiently retrieve published literature on topics within and beyond my area of expertise, and my ability to construct complex but concise search strings, I think in many ways, stems from my study of writing and revising poetry, especially formal poetry, and more so of that coming than from learning, metadata courses in school. So had I not studied poetry, I don't think that I would attend as closely to the selection and arrangement of words in my search strings as I do. And so I don't think that I would, have as precise searches if I didn't have that background in poetry. So along those lines of thinking about how it affects your work, I have a couple of questions for you. So first, how does reading and writing poetry impact your work in STEM fields? And or how do you think it affects STEM-related topics? How does your work in or with STEM fields impact how you read or write poetry? And also, what does poetry bring as a medium to the exploration of STEM topics? So it could go either way. How does STEM impact your reading and writing of poetry? Or how does poetry, reading it or writing it, impact your understanding of STEM in general?
And you want us to just attack this?
Attack it. Yeah, I know some of them will be more relevant than others. So if there is something I haven't asked that relates to this that you think is really, really important, please go ahead and answer that question that I did not ask.
I had some thoughts about your example, Danielle. And I think because, I have to confess, my big bias is this is really all just one big body of thought and work. It has different spheres of application that have really different places in our society. But they're not so different, and there's a lot of shared territory, especially if we look at them as, materials, tools, and processes with a functional lens. How do things work? And it really is kind of a systems lens. But I've read your example a number of times, and I think being in information science, you have to navigate so much all the time, and when I've never heard you say it, but I've read it before, and I was thinking it's not just, it's so much more than specificity. And you have this like selective efficiencies. You're able to navigate because it's like you can have this little working mini taxonomy for whatever your search is, and probably what poetry has really helped develop is how you notice and your tools for noticing, for listening, for noticing patterns, for maybe identifying the patterns and working with them. And, whether we're in language arts or working with data, working with physical phenomena, pattern recognition is the new black. But I think, before it's recognition, it's noticing, pattern detection. And then it's like, well, okay, we think we've recognized and named what it is, but that could be revised. But how are we going to work with it? How are we going to proceed? And having tools for staying in an attentive mode so that we can notice what falls outside of our biases a little better, and so that we can keep our sense of what the outcomes are a little bit more open and not narrow those too prematurely. And be really able to shift our frame of reference or point of view. These are all things that art opens up in ways that, at least how I experience, I would say that some of the conversations now about STEM education, we're getting that very early in art, and before we even have, say, the higher math. We're learning how to be an observer, the difference between the thing and the made thing, or the description and the object. It's like getting kind of some meta tools early on. So before that snowballs, I'm going to pull back and listen, because it's like hours worth of late night discussion there.
I actually, I was actually thinking about, I've been in Denmark now 3 years, and I actually work in data. I work in specifically in data governance and data warehousing. That's kind of been my gig for a very long time. So that sense of the metadata is absolutely crucial in my day-to-day life. But I was actually thinking about when I relocated to Denmark, having literally only visited and then suddenly being absolutely dropped into an organization, where I know theoretically how healthcare software works. So I've worked in it for over 20 years. I do not know how the Danish, I do now, but I do not know how, I did not at the time know how Danish healthcare worked, which is vastly different than American healthcare. But what we did have, and I think was very interesting, and what I appreciate about STEM, and I think actually really reflects in all knowledge activities, so that we had a shared vocabulary to begin with, and that shared vocabulary, even if it weren't one-to-one translatable from English to Danish, is what is an object, what is an object, what is a class. We can talk about what code is, how code should work, and work through those workflows of how to get the results that we wanted. But I think the sense of art about it is describing what we wanted as functionality meant finding different metaphors. And particularly being in a foreign country where your metaphors, I'm from the deep South. The look on a Dane's face when I'm like, that is as crazy as 6 squirrels in a 5 squirrel bag, is amazing. Where do these metaphors come from and why? So listening to their metaphors and really trying to understand each other in a deeper way. I do not think I could have done that without analyzing literature and how we speak to one another. I still think, my Danish is rusty. I do not think that I would be able to communicate as clearly as I do with my coworkers and management without understanding, how to build a metaphor, how to explain. A lot of my job is explaining, because I do a lot of software evaluations, I do process improvement and things like that. So explain why we need things. One has to be able to examine and explain the problem clearly so that people understand what that need is. And I'm too scientifically bent for it to be simply marketing. I need to have facts and numbers, and we need to talk about how we're going to get from point A to point B. I would not be able to do that without having read Persuasion. There are still emotions involved, because we're still people. There's still emotions involved with that. So we need to talk about, okay, how do I feel about this value set? If I'm looking between 2 pieces of software, how do I feel about those 2 pieces of software, and how do we articulate we like one more than the other without that? So there is the actual, there's the absolute qualitative. There's the qualitative evaluation. How do I feel about that? And we have the quantitative, and we have to be able to bring the two together. I find that writing or having to communicate requires both, and I rarely see them separate from one another.
You're here for articulation. I used to feel like that was my primary job.
Yeah,
Maybe I'm supposed to be designing something, but no, it's articulation.
I find that the higher I go in the IT structure, I guess I'm valued not for how good my code is, although I couldn't be here without good code, God knows. I mean, I was in America, so I had to have great code. But like I wouldn't be here without that. However, my explanation for how that is, or how we do things, is much more valued, and particularly valued in this job. Probably, I didn't realize who I had become until I got here. But being that translating between business owners and the technical side is pretty much where I live. That's my niche, and learning the metaphors of things that stand in for other things is important.
That became my place when I left hardware engineering and hardware software integration and went into consulting. And in the early 2000s, most of my clients were software companies. Most of them had something really cool that no one was quite sure what it was. You know, these new spaces, new products, and articulation became the most important product.
Why is this valuable?
And taxonomy, people knowing what are we making, what is this chunk of code over here? What are we making? What does it do? I would force them to name, you know, their little like subsystem build and things, but that, well, I know what it is, or I know what it does, but I just can't articulate it. That means you haven't arrived
at it. You don't know what it is, and therefore you shouldn't be selling it, to be honest. I mean, oh my God.
Listening is this huge part of it. When in hardware, I did a lot of failure analysis, and even in design too, you know, there's like this inherent wisdom to inanimate stuff, you know, forms and materials and structures, and listening to what the system is telling us. You know, it's kind of like listen to your data or do the math, listen to what parts are supposed to be doing what with each other or what's missing, but also, you know, what is the system telling us? We're not the only drivers.
Yeah.
And that, I think, helped me in art be more open to not driving my designs. And also art really honed that skill of stepping back, maybe because the stakes are lower, you know, or, you know, the materials
are. At least we feel like they are, right? At least we sense that they're lower than that. I got this meme from my boyfriend this morning, actually. It was like a QA engineer walks into a bar, and the QA engineer checked the faucets, made themselves a drink, drank some whiskey, swung the doors open and shut, and deemed the bar good. When the first real customer walked in, they went to the bathroom and the entire building blew up. And it's like, how does one test functionality? What is functional? What is intended functionality? What is accidental functionality? Versus what does the user actually want? And surprising, if any one of you wants to go into software engineering, no one knows what the hell they want, ever. There's a lot of, speaking of places where there are feelings. Well, I kind of would like it. There's nothing more that breaks my spirit more than someone would like, I want to have the interface be blue. I'm like, that, I cannot. I just want to throw my things in the air. No one knows what the hell they want. And so it really, most of your job, as you start working into it, yes, I completely understand. Most of your job as you're working is pulling from your users. What the hell? What functionality do you want? Why are we here? Yeah, that's, oh my God. Things that do drive me to drink is that. Jesus Christ.
I think, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, this great conversation. I wanted to follow up with something that you had mentioned, TJ. And you said, specifically during your reading, looking at issues of race is like looking at really bad code. And I wonder, is writing poetry about issues dealing with race, does that relate in any way to your background in code? Do you draw on that in tackling the issues?
Abso-freaking-lutely. I have a piece that I didn't pull out. I was trying to stay in the time frame. And it's called Methods and Materials, and it's about lynching. And it is literally about, because I mean, lynching is bad. We can pretty much accept that. It's shit. Let's just take that off the table. My issue is somebody has to go to Home Depot to get some shit. Like, there's got to be, like, there's a team. It's not just one guy, right? You just shoot somebody. So you actually have to, like, go get some wood. Are they 4x4s? Are they 2x4s? What is the tension of the rope? Like, what kind, like, do I need the small rope? That small rope may be too much, one could fall. Like, there's a physics involved in it. And the very fact that there's a physics in there offends my spirit. Like, it just absolutely does. A friend of mine who's apparently his father-in-law's grandfather, as the lore is, was in the Klan, and there are books called lynchcraft. That is the term about, if you're going to do this, you need 4x4s. 2x4s are not sufficient. There has been a scientific method and a trial and error to the absolute abhorrent evil against humanity that we perpetrate. And I'm certain we could find that in other fields as well. And I think that one should think not only of function but purpose. And that is kind of when I look at how race works in America versus how it, and now I have the versus how it works here. When I look at that, I'm thinking about, again, how one builds that house. I like architecture. And there's this beautiful house. I can't remember the name of it. It's a very, very famous house, kind of like Falling Water, but actually this long house, and it's surrounded by glass. You're like right in the middle of a wooded area. Stunning house. You walk through. There's this beautiful, the video is like you're curating. You're walking through. The problem with the house is the people who commissioned the house from this very famous architect. It's a stunningly beautiful house. They hated this house. One, it is a house where all the walls are glass, and you are only protected by by angles of certain walls. Like, I think there's only a sliding door for the bathrooms, and everything else is seen from the outdoors. They hated that house, and you have absolutely failed as a designer if you build this beautiful thing and people cannot live in it. It is a problem. Yeah. So there is absolutely a relationship between function and intention, and one should think about that as anyone is designing anything, whether that be art or a car or a plane, etc.
Function, intention, and receptivity.
Right.
Like being receptive to shifts, to changes, to mistakes, to complete redirection, things that fall outside of our intention, and navigating those three as you're making something. And whether that, I like to hold that making as either inquiry or building. Yes. An exploration and an inquiry is every bit as much something you make as a made thing is. But navigating those is what the STEM subjects and the arts really teach us in slightly different ways.
Yeah.
And I think when you move between them or you use both, you you can really kind of fill in what you might not be getting in one, especially depending on how it's being taught and who you are and what your sensibilities are. I love, there's this Carlo Rovelli video clip I love where he talks about how, you know, physics is not about certainty. And it's so easy, especially now. We're promoting STEM education more, and it's very easy to fall into this trap of thinking that's all about the absolutes and the certainties, and not realizing that, well, questioning and not knowing are central to working in science and technology. And these are iterative processes where we start by not knowing, and we test things and we listen. And art has a way, I think, of opening us to these possibilities, and so does science. And sometimes you can really import your tools from one into the other.
I think what's really interesting to me, one, whenever I hear someone tell me that a code base is flexible, I know it's shit. Every single time. Every single time. It's like, hey, there's this, like, I've got this class that has that does not have a, that has just like has like a data input that is like, has a variable data type. I'm like, absolutely not. Absolutely not. You need to know what you're actually building. I find that the older I get, and I'm not sure if this is a maturation of my craft or a maturation of spirit, that understanding and navigating uncertainty has become the thing that saves us. Everything, I mean, I began my job in Denmark the day that the WHO announced that there is COVID and we must start shutting down. I do not know how I lived. I know how I lived through it. I, was locked up in a house for a long time and talking to people in a language I didn't understand quite exactly. But having to navigate that just stew of absolutely, like, no one knew anything, and on the other side of it, the flexibility of mind and spirit is like just a sign of just growth, I think, from anyone. And I marvel at myself, but I marvel again at everyone else on Earth who managed to survive, uncertain times, and still working toward and still building systems that we think, but we don't know, will always work on the other side. There are lots of reports that were built for COVID because we didn't know what to anticipate. We worked with clinicians who were, let me capture this, let me capture this, how about this? And we had this iterative sense as we've got to know epidemiology of how COVID affects the body. Let's capture cardio information. Let's start capturing respiratory information. What about airways, etc.? We just had to slowly work our way toward that because we didn't know. And dealing with a crack team of people who we just kind of walked through a crisis was an absolute revelation. Also, no one hated each other. No one quit during COVID. Like, we quit, like, a lot of people quit right after. Like right after, like, that first wave hit really hard. A lot of people were like, okay, we can breathe. I need to get the hell out of here. But, like, during that crisis, no one quit. We just, and working with, like, a ton of people who approach with different scientific strengths was a fantastic thing. And I think that if you look at the current poetry of the day, which I think was interesting, that so many people were writing during COVID, the interesting things that fell out as people were writing just fascinated me as I was reading.
That strength, or kind of the robustness of having even a simple methodology or a complex one that puts you in a mode of observing.
Yeah.
Really gives a little bit of safety and a little bit of agency that helps us proceed and move forward through difficult or traumatic things. And I think in poetry especially, and in other kinds of art, learning or having the permission to learn different ways to leap,
Yes.
make big leaps and really unexpected connections is a huge nexus of power for us.
One of the, I remember I worked with, oh my God, what's her name? Amy Gersler. And she was like my first professor in grad school. And I sent in like my first packet of work to her, and she was telling me how like my, my images and she felt that my images and because she'd read my entry, like my packet that I applied with, and then she's looking at my work as I'm working, and she's like, the issue is not that you make large leaps. I was pulling my punches by not just making the large leap and then trying and trying, as long as I brought my reader with me. And learning what that looks, because when that works, there are some poems, like there's some poets that I read, I'm like, holy Jesus, you just took me there, took me to absolutely unanticipated.
Mm-hmm.
And trusting yourself to make those jumps, it just takes practice. It's always practice. If it looks amazing and there's 1,000 failures behind it, but yeah.
And sometimes you can just put it there and let it be a juxtaposition.
Yeah, just let it lie. See how it works.
Including yourself will just fly through it.
Well, I think there's trial and error when you're working. Sometimes you let it sit there and you kind of observe it like a sculptor or like a builder, where you're like, well, is it sturdy enough? Is it sturdy on this side? How is the tenor and how is the object of this poem, of this like how is the simile working for me? Like, have I built the thing? And I think have I built the thing on either side of the metaphor to support the jump? If you build it really well and if it's tight, you can make huge jumps, and the reader will just go with you because they accept your authority. It is amazing, but it is absolutely, there's an engineering that goes to it, and that works with the same reason why I can't watch movies. And grad school broke me in that way. I can't watch a movie that the suspension of disbelief. I'm like, what are you doing? Like that eighth season of Game of Thrones just broke my heart. I'm like, come on. You didn't build any of that. You built no credibility for that leap. Dany she's not going to burn down the whole damn city,
I love that you focus on iteration, because as important as it is in writing poetry, it's so important to so many other areas, whether you're in a STEM-related field or not. I can't tell you how many times I have to explain to students that there's never one perfect search that you come out with right off the bat. You will go through 20, 30 iterations of a search before you get even close to what it is you want in your result list. And I just think that's such an important point, that iteration, it's something that's shared across, whether you're writing poetry or you're prototyping a new program. So important.
It's part of life. I mean, that's how living systems work as well.
Mm-hmm.
And people often, a very common way that questions are phrased to artists who work in really divergent fields is, how do you switch? Or, how did that prepare you for? And I would just come right out. I used to just say, well, physics and poetry, my God, you're in both disciplines, you're working on long, insoluble problems that might take years, and the best is you're going to arrive at an approximation of an ideal solution. And then, you're going to do the same thing again for several years. So that, iteration is it.
I think that's fascinating to me about, as we're starting to work, you also never know what is a stepping stone or not. Like, all knowledge is fungible. And there are plenty of things that I've learned from, one of the first languages that I learned to write in code is Lisp, with lots and lots of recursion. And the amounts of times that I will look at a poem that I wrote and I'm like, well, that's just a recursive function, Tanya. I can tell, or even with the, that poem that I read earlier about, like, let's say this were a poem, and these simple recursions of this happened, no, it didn't, this happened, no, it didn't, and you're slowly fleshing out what actually did happen. But you never know, like that. Could I have written that poem without that experience? Absolutely not. And so, yeah, my brain wouldn't even work that way. It's like, how do I solve problems? I wouldn't solve problems without doing it in this way. Mm-hmm. So I think that there is something about not throwing away lessons that you learn over time. That whether it is in the humanities or in STEM, there are plenty of things that I do working as a program manager that I'm like, that's great code. No one will use it.
That's the kind of brilliance that that's the kind of functional level that's not being taught as well. Yeah. People I know, good friends of mine, will say, you're sending me all these junior engineers who know how to write great code, but no one knows how to figure out what needs to be written.
No one asks, should we write that? I think that's that's the Jurassic Park. I call it the Jurassic Park problem. Whole lot of coulda, not enough shoulda. Like, what were you thinking? Let's just put a lot of dinosaurs in a park and not really, protect anyone. What's wrong with you? No, that's stupid. And I mentor young developers not every single day. We just had a lot of turnover. So I have two brand new right out of school, and they are often coming to me with like, hey, this is a really neat way to solve this problem. Like, no one can follow you. And this is a team sport. Learning that STEM is a team sport when the entire culture believes that it's this lone genius on a hill. Absolutely not. I know we're
almost out of time. I want to tag on to what you said about no lesson is wasted. The other is that no model is wasted. And so you get these great models of whether it's architecture in your case, or, is it a lens? Is it a filter? Is it a membrane? All these amazing models that when they're kind of in your cache, so to speak, you draw on them without even realizing it, whether it's for imagery or for problem solving.
So many natural structures appear and are, and we treat them as if they're new, but so many natural structures that we see are reflected in what we build, which I think is absolutely amazing.
Well, this is an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for all the insights on these intersections between poetry and your particular fields. Before we head off into the Q&As, I just wanted to ask you, as far as our audience goes, what is one thing that you'd like our attendees to take time to consider with regard to the intersection or the synergy between STEM areas and reading or writing poetry? Or if you'd like to challenge our attendees to write a poem, what prompt would you suggest based on all the conversation we've been having?
Danielle, was that a question for us as a prompt?
Asking you if you'd like to suggest a prompt, or if there's something you'd like folks to just walk away thinking about from this evening.
I always suggest looking at weird news stories or stories that you don't understand. You're reading a story and you're like, I'm not sure how that happened, and slowly write a poem about it. And that poem can either be kind of like a retelling of that story, or simply begin with a bulleted list and then build sentences around the actual logic of this happened and this happened and this happened. Gold is found in there, particularly in terms of, I think what is interesting is you will find the moment that your narrator begins to assert itself is very interesting because you find your voice in that. But first, build the framework of I'm retelling a story in the newspaper. And then as you're building sentences of it, you will begin to hear that voice that needs to be asserted itself in that piece.
That's awesome.
I have kind of a formal suggestion, and it could be poetry or prose, and that is to do a mismatch between form and theme, even though I rarely like to talk of them as if they're separate. But if you take something that's really familiar and put it in the unfamiliar, it really forces you to figure out what are the defining characteristics, both of the thing you want to write about and the form that you're using to do it. So there are some examples. There's Elizabeth Bishop's poem, like 12 O'Clock News, where it's a poem in the form of a news report, as if some miniature alien landed on her writing desk and described the territory. But you could take anything familiar from your area of work or just from everyday life, a menu, a lab report, an abstract. And let's say you want to master the abstract. I'm not writing good abstracts. I need to improve that. Write an abstract like on roommate dynamics, for instance, or a menu of faulty lab equipment or something. It'll help you see more about how the form functions. Or if you do something, say, like a menu, which people know what a menu is, that'll help you explore the subject matter a little better. What really defines this, or what's unusual about this, what's worth elaborating on. Abstract of a Marvel movie, a white paper on whatever, on Thanksgiving hell with my extended family or something. You can do this kind of really gross scale mismatch, and that will help keep you out of overly familiar territory and learning more about either the form or the subject or both. So that's kind of an easy prompt.
That's great. I love using existing forms and re-envisioning them as poems. When I was first in library school, I used to have to process every Sunday like a book of about 100, a card of about 100 books. And what I used to do is take the titles and do like centos out of them to make these short poems out of the book titles. And there's some really interesting things that came up that I then developed into other poems. So I love that idea. And I love the idea with the newspapers, because at the library, we can help you find interesting news stories in the databases. So for those students who are watching, please do come and see us. We can help you, start getting started with writing poetry using newspaper articles. So we have reached just about the end of our time. I just want to make sure if anybody has any questions, I've opened up the Q&A panel. I don't see any questions there, but you can also use the chat. I'm looking through right now just to make sure that I haven't missed anybody's questions. There's a lot of love for you guys in the chat right now.
Aw.
Wonderful readings. Oh yes, it was really wonderful, and the conversation was so wonderful as well. Last chance for okay, so we have a question. What is your favorite poetry book that uses a lot of science?
I'm trying to think, is it science? I'm like, is it sciencey? Life on Mars.
Oh, I was thinking of
it's such a hard question too, because what does it mean?
I know, what is sciencey? Yeah.
To me, sometimes it's more about approach and process than about subject matter. I love Kim Shuck's kind of hybrid lyrical stories called Rabbit Stories. Mm-hmm. And, it starts with this this sickly young woman, quantum physicist doing laundry. So, it's just this like beautiful confluence of physics and indigenous wisdom and being a young woman in the United States today and navigating family dynamics. And it's very lyrical prose. I'm going to throw that one out there.
I would not say it's science. I would say it's one of the best memoirs I've ever read in my life. Memoir of Ulysses S. Grant. as he discusses how he deals with the supply chain in the Civil War, is one, read it just because it is an interesting human being talking about an interesting time of his life. But he managed, when he was in the Mexican Civil War, he managed the supply chain. So he talks about the Civil War, the US Civil War, and how he manages the supply chain and how that ends up turning the curtains on the war. He is absolutely precise, he is absolutely specific, and he takes the mundane, somehow takes these mundane tasks, and it's so charged with everything else that's at stake. But there are sometimes he's simply talking about, like, I had to move this here and this here. We lost a lot of people, that was horrible. And just, it is a fascinating way to see someone who is, I wouldn't say necessarily scientifically, but logistically gifted.
I'll throw out a couple more poetry titles. Reel to Reel by Alan Shapiro has just some absolutely fantastic leaps into cosmology and astronomy, as well as these super shrewd dives into family dynamics and social pressures. And it has a beautiful kind of double spiral drawing of galaxies on the cover. And the other is a very new book by Caroline Goodwin called Matanuska, and it's almost like collage where she weaves in botanical knowledge and pandemic data, things just like mortality rates, death counts, the wisdom of the different herbs or plant species, that she has a methodology for what she selects each time. And the book is a series of these written all in the same format. That's called Matanuska. I'll type that in here, as well as Alan's book.
When you talked about botany, Glick's, which one is it? The one where she's in the garden. I'm trying to remember which one it is. It's this fascinating thing about it. It begins with gardening. Let's see. She should have a list. Trying to find the name of life. Not that one, not that one. Okay, here we go. Wild Iris, where she slowly talks about different. So she has like lots, all about flowers, all about botany. She does bring in a little, and then she just has these jumps where she takes, parameters from memory and goes. Absolutely fantastic.
Great, thank you so much for all the recommendations. I'm going to make sure I capture those and put links to all that material in the description when we put the video out on YouTube. I just would like to remind everybody, if you want reminders about upcoming readings, or you want a reminder when the video is posted, you can fill out the form in the chat. And if you want to see what's coming up, I've also put the link to our homepage as well. I want to thank you both again, Lisa and TJ, for a wonderful reading and discussion. And I know that we're all dealing with time differences. Thank you, TJ, for staying up super late. I know it's mid-afternoon.
It's my bedtime. It's
Yes,
fine.
yes.
I don't. Yeah, I usually go to bed about this time, so it worked out perfectly.
Well, thank you so much again. The video will be posted soon. And again, thank you so much for tonight. It was great reading and great conversation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you both. This has been so much fun, and thanks to everyone who's here posing all these questions and the fabulous chat, the love stream.
Thank you guys. You guys are lovely. Thank you.
All right, have a great evening, everyone. Great night. And I hope everyone will join us for the next reading. So take care, everyone.
Hi.